Hello, book groupers. We're ready for chapter 4. This is Piggle Wiggle, the bad table manners cure. And I'm sure all of you have very nice table manners, but the little boy in this chapter does not. Slurp, 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 slurp. Christopher Brown was through with his milk. His mother was in the pantry polishing silver. She did not even have to go into the kitchen to see that Christopher had finished eating. She could tell because those awful noises had stopped. Mrs. Brown was kind of ashamed of Christopher's table manners, and she talked and talked and talked and talked to him, but so far it hadn't done any good. Christopher was now 10 years old, and he was a very nice little boy in other ways. He had curly red hair, he was a great baseball player, he was a good sport, he got excellent marks in school, and he kept his room reasonably tidy, but he had simply horrible table manners. No, that isn't right. He really had no table manners at all. He ate just like an animal, a starving, wild animal. Mr. and Mrs. Brown had gradually become used to Christopher's table manners. Of course, they made him eat in the kitchen, but what worried Mrs. Brown so terribly was that someday one of Christopher's friends may invite him to dinner. Not just a children's party. Chris had been to lots of those, and he was so much fun and so good at the games that the children didn't really mind if he ate like a starving animal. But Mrs. Brown was afraid he'd be asked to stay overnight, maybe, or maybe visit in another town, or maybe go to the country with some of his friends' families, and it would just be dreadful when Christopher took his first bite and began to chew. Christopher chewed with his mouth open, so open you could see all the food as it rinsed around in his mouth. He also smacked his lips so loud it sounded like someone was slapping their hands in water. He gulped when he swallowed. He washed all of his food down with glugs of milk. He made enormous piles of meat and potatoes and peas and carrots and gravy on top of his fork, and then put his fork so far down his throat you could hardly see the handle. He even used his thumbs and fingers to assemble big loads of food onto his fork. He propped his knife and fork against his plate with the handles on the table. He buttered slices of bread on his hand. He chopped and smushed and smashed and mixed his food until his dinner looked like dog food. He picked up his soup bowl and held it under his chin, and he slurped his soup, and he talked while he was chewing and eating, and he gestured with his fork when it was loaded with food, and bits of food flew round the room. I could go on and on about Christopher's table manners, but I think I've told you enough to show you that having Christopher sitting beside you at the table would have been a little bit like sitting next to a wolf. Watching him eat was not a sight to make you feel hungry. Mrs. Brown rubbed polish on the silver and thought about Christopher's table manners. She was feeling sad. There should be a school for table manners, she said to herself, and attendance should be compulsory. Compulsory means you have to go. The telephone rang. It was Dick's mother. Do you remember Dick, the selfishness cure? Dick's mother said, I'm having a few of Dick's friends over for dinner a week from Saturday. My brother Charles is going to visit for a few days, and I thought it would be so nice if some of Dick's friends could come and meet Charles. He's got movies of lions and tigers in Africa, you know. And I'm asking Christopher, Hubert, that's the little boy that never tidied his room, if you remember, and I'm asking Larry, because there's going to be 12 grown-ups at dinner too. Mrs. Brown thanked Mrs. Thompson, said she knew Christopher would be delighted, and then went back into the kitchen and made herself a very big pot of black coffee. Her hands shook as she poured her first cup. 12 grown-ups, she thought, and Mrs. Thompson's famous brother Charles, all sitting at the dinner table. with Christopher. She couldn't bear to think about it. What am I going to do? She said. She would give Christopher a good talking to, and he'd be nice and pleasant, and he'd agree to everything she said, and he'd really try to have better manners for a meal or two. And then back he'd go to slurping and splashing and smushing and crunching and gurgling and gulping. Oh, Mrs. Brown shuddered. Oh, this wouldn't do. She called her friend, Mrs. Prensel. Mrs. Prensel, she said, I'm not going to beat around the bush. My son Christopher just has the worst table manners in the whole world, and I don't know how to cure them. Do Percy, Pamela, and Potter have nice table manners? I've never really noticed, said Mrs. Prensel. You see, Percy, Pamela, and Potter have always been allowed to make their own decisions about everything. I haven't actually seen them eat a meal for years. That is not possible, you know that, don't you? You eat with your family. What do they live on then? Asked Mrs. Brown. Oh, I'm sure they eat, said Mrs. Prensel, but only when they think about it. I do know that Potter only eats peanut butter and seeds, and he always eats at night. He says eating during the day is much too common. And Pamela eats weenies and bananas. She does her own shopping too, you know. She peels the bananas herself. Isn't she clever? And she's only 7. Can you peel your own bananas? Oh, well, I think it's dreadful to allow your children to live on weenies and bananas, said Mrs. Brown. What does Percy eat? Percy, let me see, said Mrs. Prensel. Oh, yes. Oh, he eats anything. He's most cooperative. Just give him cookies, candy, marshmallows, cake, ice cream, root beer, and you don't have to worry about him at all. He's fine. Well, said Mrs. Brown, I guess everyone has their problems. You've really cheered me up a lot, thank you. I hope you know a good doctor. You're going to need one. Oh, no, said Mrs. Prensel. Mr. Prensel and I were both brought up like that, and we're both terribly happy. Mr. Prensel never eats anything but salmon and grape nuts, and I never eat. Before she could finish talking, Mrs. Brown hung up the phone. Salmon and grape nuts? She then called. Do you know who she would call for help? Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. She told Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle the whole problem. She didn't leave out a thing when she described the way that Christopher ate. And when she told about the dinner party he'd been invited to and how ashamed she was going to be, she even got tears in her eyes. Now, Mrs. Brown, said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Christopher's such a darling boy. I know how to cure him. It's going to take a bit of cooperation on your part. Cooperation means you have to work together with someone. Maybe a little inconvenient, but I have the cure. I'm going to lend you Lester. Lester? Said Mrs. Brown. Who's he? Do you have any ideas who Lester may be? Come up with an idea, then I'll tell you who Lester is and see if you're right. Did you say it out loud? Lester is a pig, said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. No, said Mrs. Brown. Not a pig? I haven't got anywhere to keep a pig. This is a restricted neighbourhood. No, just a minute, said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. Lester's absolutely no trouble. He has beautiful manners. He's very quiet and sleeps in the basement. Nobody in the neighbourhood need know about him. Where shall I put his trough? Asked Mrs. Brown. Oh, Lester doesn't use a trough, said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. That's the whole point. Lester has the most beautiful table manners you've ever seen. I want him to eat at the kitchen table with Christopher. You'll be very surprised. Lester will teach Christopher how to eat." "That sounds fantastic," said Mrs. Brown. "I know," said Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. "Every mother I send Lester to has the same feeling. Let me tell you, once you've had Lester in your house, you won't want to let him come home to me. I always have that trouble. Everybody adores Lester, and they always want to keep him. And by the way, he likes to sleep on a clean blanket on the basement floor. And also he likes to have the basement door left open so he can go out for his exercise after dark and when the neighbours are asleep, so no one will see him. And have Christopher stop by after school, and I'll send Lester over. Mrs. Martin returned him just this morning." "What does he eat?" asked Mrs. Brown. "What do you think Lester eats? What kind of food would pigs eat? Colt, do you know what sort of food pigs eat? Do you have pigs on your farm?" "Oh, he'll eat exactly what Christopher does," said Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, "except bigger portions. Oh, and yes, I forgot. He's very fond of coffee, and he takes cream and sugar, and he often drinks 5 cups of coffee at a meal." "Do pigs really drink coffee?" "Then don't worry about a thing, Mrs. Brown. Fix Lester a nice bed on a clean blanket by the furnace, and he'll solve all of your problems. Well, goodbye." Mrs. Brown went upstairs and got a clean blue blanket out of the guest room closet, and with a few misgivings, she unfolded it and put it on the floor beside the furnace in the basement. The misgiving is she's not sure whether this will work. She's having some doubts. She looked at the clock. She had 10 minutes before Christopher was due home. She made some hot cocoa with whipped cream, fixed 2 plates of ginger cookies, one much larger than the other, and polished 2 large red apples. She got out spoons and napkins, and then remembering what Mrs. Piggle Wiggle had said about Lester's manners, she took 2 of her good linen doilies and put them on the kitchen table. At exactly 3:30, there was a knock at the back door, and there stood Christopher, who usually never knocked, and beside him was a large white pig. Christopher said, "Mother, this is Lester, and we're going to keep him, and he's fun, and he's so smart. He knows everything, don't you, boy?" Mrs. Brown said, "Come in, Christopher, and Lester, I have some hot cocoa for you." "Oh, boy," said Christopher. He dashed over to the table and began to gulp down his hot cocoa. Lester walked daintily into the kitchen, closed the door carefully behind him, climbed up, and sat down across the table from Christopher. Christopher was jamming his mouth full of cookies and washing it down with gulps of hot cocoa. Lester looked at him, and then he took one cookie carefully between the split in his front hoof and ate it very slowly and with tiny bites. He picked up his cocoa cup with his hoof, and after a small sip, put it carefully down again. Then he patted his snout with his napkin. Christopher stopped eating, or at least he stopped chewing, to watch Lester eat. Christopher's mouth was open, of course, full of food. He had whipped cream all over his lip and crumbs on his chin. Lester reached across the table and gently wiped the cream off Christopher's lip, closed Christopher's mouth, and brushed the crumbs off his chin. Christopher was delighted. "Gosh, you're so smart, Lester," he said with his mouth full. Lester put his hoof across his lips and pointed to Christopher's full cheeks to indicate no talking with a full mouth. Christopher looked up at his mother. "Isn't he smart, Mum? Isn't he wonderful? Isn't Lester wonderful?" Lester looked at Mrs. Brown, and she was quite sure that he winked at her. Here's Lester. You see him? Not sure if I put that in front of the camera. Brushing off Christopher's face. It usually took Christopher about 3¼ minutes to gulp down his cookies and his hot cocoa. This day, either because of the excitement of having Lester or because of the good example set by Lester, Christopher was still eating at 4:00. Mrs. Brown came downstairs to clear up the hot cocoa and was most surprised to find Christopher had only just finished, and Lester was only halfway through. Mrs. Brown asked Lester if he'd like some more hot cocoa, and he nodded his head and handed her his cocoa cup. Christopher said he didn't care for any more, and he began to eat his apple, crashing and crunching and smashing and mushing and gulping it down. Lester reached across the table, took the apple away from him, got down off his chair, went to a drawer in the kitchen, took out a small knife, and cut Christopher's apple up into small pieces, cored each piece, and put them on the empty cookie plate, and handed the plate to Christopher. Christopher put a whole section of apple into his mouth in one go. Lester shook his head at him, reached over and took one of the sections, and showed Christopher how to take a very small bite. Chris gulped down the first section and took another, but this time, instead of stuffing it all in his mouth in one go, he took a small bite, and Lester nodded approvingly at him. At 4:30, Lester and Christopher had finished their hot cocoa and apples, and Christopher took Lester down to the basement to show him his bed. Lester looked around the furnace room, straightened out several wrinkles in the blue blanket, and then nodded at Christopher to show him that the bed was all right. They went into the game room. There was a red tennis ball on the floor. Lester picked it up and threw it at Chris. Chris caught it and threw it back, and Lester caught it in his mouth. Then he took it out with his hooves and threw it back at Chris. They played ball until it was time for the Mystery Cowboy radio program that Christopher liked to listen to every evening. "Gee, Lester," said Christopher, "hope you don't mind, but I always listen to a bunch of radio programs at 5:00. If you'd rather play ball, though, I don't have to." Lester shook his head and turned and pointed to the fireplace where there was a nice fire burning in the grate. "Okay," said Chris. Lester nodded politely and stretched out on the hearthrug in front of the fire. Christopher crouched by the radio and began to listen to the programs. It was actually quite peaceful. When Mr. Brown came home from work, Mrs. Brown told him about the invitation to dinner to meet Mrs. Thompson's famous brother, Charles. She told him about Mrs. Piggle and about Lester. He was most sceptical about Lester being able to teach Christopher table manners. "I don't think that'll work," he said, and he laughed loudly. "Shh," said Mrs. Brown. "Lester's right down in the basement, dear, and he really does have the most beautiful table manners." Mr. Brown said, "Well, I guess I'll go down and have a look at Lester then." He went down the basement stairs, whistling. Mr. Brown looked first in the wood room. No Lester. Then he looked in the furnace room, and he saw a blue blanket lying on the floor. So he picked it up, shook it, took it into the laundry, and stuffed it in the laundry chute. He went around the laundry, peering under the washing machine and the laundry tubs and the ironing board, saying oink, 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 oink. No response. He noticed the basement door was open a little, so he closed it and locked it. He muttered about burglars and how careless it was to leave the door open. Do you remember the instructions that Mrs. Piggle gave them about Lester, what he liked and didn't like? Where he liked to sleep? Did he like the door open or closed? He heard the radio from the game room, decided to go in and ask Christopher where he was keeping the pig. He was surprised to see Lester lying on the hearthrug in front of a fire, apparently listening to the radio. "So this is Lester, is it?" he said. "Oink, oink." Lester opened his eyes and stared at him. Then he realised it was Mr. Brown, and he jumped to his feet and held out his hoof. "Well, I'll be blowed," said Mr. Brown, and he shook hands with Lester and smiled. "Isn't Lester smart, Dad? Isn't he?" said Christopher. Mr. Brown said, "I always said you could teach a pig anything, you know. Pigs are the smartest animals there are, you know." Lester looked at him. He hadn't forgiven him for the oink oink comment. Mr. Brown bent over and began to scratch Lester behind the ears, but Lester gently but firmly pushed his hand away and then went to lie by the fire again. Mr. Brown said, well, I guess I'd better see how dinner's coming. Then Christopher said, just a minute, Dad. I want to show you how Lester plays ball. Come on, Lester, let's play. He picked up the red tennis ball, and Lester rather unwillingly got up to his feet. Christopher threw him the ball, and Lester caught it in his mouth and threw it back. Christopher threw it again, and Lester caught it, but this time Lester threw it to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown was so surprised he almost didn't catch it, but you could tell he was quite pleased because he kept looking at Lester and smiling. They played three-person catch, or two-person and a pig catch, until Mrs. Brown called to say dinner was ready and to tell Christopher to go wash his hands. There's a small bathroom off the game room, and Christopher rushed in, and just like he usually did, he wet his hands, splashed a bit of water on his face, and was just going to wipe all the dirt off on the towel when Lester, who'd followed him in, took the towel away, put it back on the towel rack, put the stopper in the basement, filled it with warm water, and began to wash his face and hooves with soap. When he had finished, he let the water out of the sink, filled it up with warm water for Christopher. Is that how you wash your hands, warm water and soap? While Lester dried his nice clean face and hooves, Christopher also washed thoroughly, using soap. He dried his face and hands, and then Lester took the hairbrush and smoothed the bristles on his neck and around his ears. Christopher watched him. Then he also brushed his hair too, and they both went upstairs for dinner. Unfortunately, Mrs. Brown, forgetting about Lester, had made ribs for dinner. They were lovely and crispy and brown, and Mr. Brown gave Lester an extra large helping. Lester sat at the table and smiled because everything smelled delicious. He unfolded his napkin, took a sip of milk, and cut off a piece of the ribs. He put it in his mouth and began to chew. Then he turned quite pale and pushed his plate away. "Don't you like ribs, Lester?" said Christopher. Lester took his spare ribs and put them on Christopher's plate. "I'll go tell Mum you don't like ribs," said Christopher. "She'll make you some eggs or something. That's what she does for Daddy when he doesn't like something." He began to get down from his chair, but Lester reached over and took hold of his shoulder and shook his head and pointed to Christopher's dinner. And by chewing motions, he indicated that Christopher should continue eating his dinner. Lester instead had 2 helpings of dressing, sweet potatoes, and green beans. He also ate his salad, 2 dishes of peaches, 2 pieces of apple cake, and he drank 4 cups of coffee. Christopher ate all of his dinner with much less noise than usual. He even asked Lester if it was all right if he picked his ribs up and ate it with his fingers. After dinner, he and Christopher and Mr. Brown played ball for a while, and then it was time for Chris to go to bed. He and Mr. Brown said good night to Lester and went upstairs. Lester went down to the basement. His bed wasn't there. He looked all over the basement. Perhaps Mrs. Brown had moved it. He couldn't find it anywhere. Then he checked to see if the back door had been left open, like he liked, and found it was shut and locked. He looked around again to see if he could find the blanket. It wasn't anywhere. So he decided to go upstairs and ask Mrs. Brown where it was. He went up the basement stairs, had quite a difficult time opening the basement door, which stuck a bit. He trotted through the kitchen and the dining room and then stood politely at the door to the living room. Mr. and Mrs. Brown were playing cards and arguing a little, so they didn't see Lester for a few minutes. And when Mrs. Brown happened to look up, she said, "Oh, Lester, have you come to visit us?" Lester shook his head. Mrs. Brown said, "What's the matter? Is it cold in the basement?" Lester shook his head. "I know," said Mr. Brown. "You want me to play ball, do you?" Lester shook his head. And then deciding that would be a good way to get them down to the basement, he then nodded his head several times. Mr. Brown beamed. "Come on then," he said. "You come too, Alice, and watch." Mrs. Brown said she'd like to do that, so they all went downstairs. Lester, in spite of his perfect manners, went first, and instead of going into the game room, he went to stand by the furnace room door. Mrs. Brown looked in the furnace room. "Where's your blanket, Lester?" she asked. Lester shook his head. "That's the funniest thing," said Mrs. Brown. "I put the blue blanket on the floor here this afternoon. I wonder what could have happened to it." Mr. Brown looked a little bit embarrassed. He went and got it out of the laundry. He said, I didn't know it was Lester's bed. I just thought it had fallen on the floor and I tidied it up. Mrs. Brown spread it back out again on the floor, and Lester carefully smoothed out the wrinkles and turned one corner over like a little pillow. Mr. and Mrs. Brown watched in amazement. I've never in my life seen such a smart animal, said Mrs. Brown. He seems almost human. Lester looked up at her. Well, you're all ready for bed now, so I guess we'll go upstairs. He started towards the stairway with Mrs. Brown, but Lester took his hooves and gently pushed Mr. Brown towards the basement door. Now what's the matter? Said Mr. Brown. Basement door's locked, not a thing to worry about. That's the trouble, said Mrs. Brown. Mrs. Piggle told me to be sure and leave the basement door open a crack, so Lester can go out at night and get his exercise. She unlocked the door and opened it an inch. Lester nodded in approval, waited politely while they went through the doorway and set off up the stairs. Then he went into the furnace room, lay down on the blue blanket and fell fast asleep. The next morning, when Christopher came downstairs and found his mum frying bacon, he was shocked. Mum, you can't do that. You can't cook bacon. I hadn't thought about it. Bacon's one of your favourite foods, Chris. But, Mum, bacon comes from pigs. Oh! Mrs. Brown put her hand over her mouth. Oh, I didn't even think about that. How awful. I'm so sorry. Do you think Lester's upset? Do you think he'll notice? I think he noticed about dinner, said Chris. Quick, hurry up before he comes upstairs again. Give the bacon to your father and I'll make you and Lester cereal and eggs on toast. Hurry up. She opened the back door and shooed out the bacon smoke with her apron so that when Lester came upstairs a few minutes later, all that he could smell in the kitchen was oatmeal and buttered toast. As usual at breakfast, Chris dumped a pitcher of cream on top of his mush, put on 4 teaspoons of sugar, and began to stir it as if he was mixing cement. When the mush was exactly the right consistency and the right degree of coolness, he lifted the bowl to just below his chin so he could shovel it in as fast as possible. This morning, forgetting about Lester, he began to do his usual. He dumped the whole pitcher of cream and was just reaching for the sugar when he looked up and saw Lester looking rather sadly into the empty cream pitcher. Oh, Lester, I didn't mean to be such a pig, said Chris. I didn't mean to be so rude. I'll get you some more cream. Wait a minute. Lester shook his head. He reached over and picked up Chris's bowl of oatmeal and carefully poured half of the cream onto his own cereal. Oh, that'll work, said Chris. We'll each have half then. Want some sugar? Lester nodded and carefully helped himself to 2 teaspoonfuls of sugar. Chris, who was watching, did the same. When Chris began to cement mix, Lester reached over and took his spoon away and showed Chris how to eat cereal politely, 1 spoonful at a time, lifting slowly and daintily from the bowl and putting a spoon into your mouth each time. Chris tried it. Hey, it tastes much better than the old way. Lester nodded and smiled. When Chris began to scrape and lick his dish clean, Lester shook his head and pointed to his spoon that was placed on the plate beside his empty dish. When Chris was eating his scrambled eggs, Lester had to reach over and close his mouth 3 times. He showed him how to break his toast into small pieces, that he shouldn't hold the toast in the palm of his hand when spreading jam. He made him put down his milk glass and wipe the milk from his lip between sips. Chris didn't mind, and he hugged Lester goodbye when he left for school and promised to run all the way home to have lunch with him. It was a beautiful morning, and Mrs. Brown did a large wash. When she went to hang it on the line, Lester even helped her carry the clothes basket of wet clothes from the basement. He handed her the clothes pegs as she needed them, and when the washing was all done, he lay on the grass in the sun, quite hidden from the neighbours by the sheets and a tablecloth. Mrs. Brown knelt down and carefully stroked his back. Thanks so much for helping with the clothes, Lester. And thank you so much for helping with Chris's manners. I see a great improvement already, Lester grunted. By the night of Dick Thompson's dinner party, Chris's table manners were absolutely perfect, and the Brown family loved Lester so much they couldn't even bear to think of him leaving. Lester came upstairs with Chris while he bathed and got dressed. He washed Christopher's back and made him wash his ears twice. He made him polish his shoes, and he even sent him back to his room to get a clean handkerchief for his pocket. After Chris had gone, Lester went out to the kitchen to wait for dinner. Noticing that there was no place set for him on the kitchen table, and feeling a little bit lonely for Chris, he went down to the basement to lie on his blanket. Mrs. Brown called to him, "Lester, I thought as long as Chris wasn't here, you could eat in the dining room with Mr. Brown and me." Lester nodded his head vigorously and trotted happily after her into the dining room. They had a delicious roast dinner. He ate 3 large helpings, and his table manners were so beautiful, Mr. and Mrs. Brown stared at him in admiration. After dinner, Mr. Brown and Lester played catch while Mrs. Brown washed the dishes. Then they all sat in the living room and listened to the radio and waited for Christopher to come home. He came home at 10 o'clock, bursting with excitement and filled with stories of Africa and lions. Everyone listened to his stories. They heard what the Thompsons had to eat and what Uncle Charlie had looked like, and then they all went to bed. The next morning, Mrs. Brown had 2 telephone calls. The first one made her very proud. It was from Mrs. Thompson. She said she just had to call Mrs. Brown and tell her that in all her life she had never seen such a beautifully behaved boy as Christopher. And, she said, his table manners are simply perfect. Mrs. Brown smiled and smiled. The second telephone call was from Mrs. Piggle, and it made Mrs. Brown very sad. Mrs. Piggle asked Mrs. Brown how she liked Lester. Mrs. Brown said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle, he has such perfectly beautiful manners. He's such a wonderful teacher. He's so charming. And I just feel like crying when I think of all the times I've said that somebody's eating like a pig or is a selfish pig." Mrs. Piggle said, "Well, dear, all pigs aren't like Lester, I'm sure, but he really is a dear, isn't he? And I will have to take him away from you soon. I've just had an emergency call from Mrs. Burbank. Do tell Christopher to bring Lester over on his way back to school today." Mrs. Brown said goodbye to Lester later. She had tears in her eyes, and she thought that perhaps even he seemed a little sad at leaving. It's the end of the chapter. Christopher now has beautiful table manners, just like you all. And the next chapter for the next book group is chapter 5, and it's called The Interrupters. When you interrupt someone or something. Have a lovely day. Bye, book group.